It was a typical afternoon in the heart of the city, streets bustling with life, the steady hum of car engines, the chatter of pedestrians, and the occasional honk of a horn. The city seemed to move in its usual rhythm, everyone caught in their own routines. But beneath the surface, something was off. There was a tension in the air, something that made the normalcy feel fragile, as though anything could disrupt the flow at any moment. The moment came in the form of a scream, a sharp, panicked cry that sliced through the noise of the street. People turned to look, some slowing their steps, others stopping altogether. In the middle of the road, a young man was lying motionless, his body sprawled across the asphalt. Tyler, a white man in his early 20s, had been run over. His face was bruised and bloodied, and his body lay unnaturally still, the impact of the accident clear in the gash on his forehead and the blood pooling around him. Pedestrians gathered around, their phones held high, recording the moment but doing nothing. Some looked on with wide eyes, others exchanged murmurs, but nobody moved. The crowd had grown, but it remained frozen, transfixed by the sight of the young man in the street. The few who seemed concerned merely pulled their phones out to document the scene, capturing the tragedy as a spectacle rather than as a life-or-death emergency. In the midst of the growing crowd, Malik, a young black boy in his late teens, emerged from the side. Dressed simply in a hoodie and jeans, he stood still for a moment, scanning the situation. His eyes immediately fell on Tyler, the man lying in the street, and in that instant, everything else faded away. There was no hesitation in his step as he rushed forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The sight of someone in distress, struggling for life, triggered something deep inside him. Instincts he couldn't ignore. Malik knelt beside Tyler without a second thought, his hands moving quickly but steadily. He didn't know the man, didn't have any connection to him, but that didn't matter. The urgency in the moment was all that mattered now. The crowd around them continued to murmur, some still filming, others standing back unsure of what to do. Malik ignored them, focused entirely on the person lying in front of him. He could feel the tension in the air, the growing sense of panic as the minutes passed. Without breaking his concentration, Malik pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed emergency services, his voice steady, even though his heart was racing. "Please, you need to send an ambulance. There's a man who's been hit by a car. He's bleeding badly," Malik said into the phone. "I'm trying to stop the bleeding, but you need to hurry." His hands were trembling slightly as he pressed them to the wound on Tyler's head, applying pressure to slow the bleeding. His fingers were sticky with blood, but he didn't flinch. His focus never wavered. He wasn't going to let this man die on the street, not if he could do something about it. As Malik worked, the crowd continued to watch, their eyes darting between him and the injured man. Some whispered amongst themselves, wondering why a boy like Malik was the one acting, the one who seemed so calm in the midst of such chaos. But Malik didn't care about the stares, the whispers, or the phones being held up to capture the scene. All he cared about was saving the life that lay before him. The air around them grew thicker with urgency. The sirens in the distance grew louder, but in those few moments, it felt as if time itself had slowed. The bystanders stood frozen, as if unsure how to act, while Malik knelt, trying to keep the man alive until help arrived. Despite the chaos, despite the mob, Malik's focus remained unwavering. He knew what he had to do. As Malik continued to press his hands to Tyler's bleeding head, trying to keep him alive, the crowd around them began to shift. What had started as curious onlookers soon turned into murmurs of discontent. People started to whisper amongst themselves, casting sideways glances at Malik. The once hushed whispers grew louder as more individuals joined the circle, drawn by the spectacle, but soon forming opinions about the scene unfolding before them. Why is he helping him? What's he doing here? Someone muttered, their voice laced with suspicion. Malik could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the tension growing thicker by the second. It was no longer just about saving a life. Now, it felt like his presence was under a magnifying glass. Then, one man, Jim, a middle-aged white man with a hardened face, stepped forward. His words were sharp, cutting through the murmur of the crowd. What's he doing? He doesn't belong here. His voice was loud and commanding, and it instantly pierced the air, silencing the rest of the crowd for a brief moment. The hostile tone he set rippled outward, and more voices began to join in. Yeah, why's he helping a white man? Someone else spat. Malik's hands shook slightly, but he didn't falter in his efforts to keep Tyler alive. His eyes stayed fixed on the man in front of him, his breath shallow but steady. But the hostile voices surrounding him made it harder to focus. The situation was escalating quickly. "Get away from him!" another voice shouted, followed by more taunts and derogatory names hurled in his direction. "He doesn't deserve your help. He's just going to get up and go back to his own kind." The crowd was no longer a neutral group of bystanders. They had become a mob, and their anger was palpable. Some people began to circle around Malik, taunting him. Others raised their phones to capture the scene, but no one stepped forward to offer assistance. The focus had shifted from saving Tyler's life to vilifying Malik for the simple act of helping. Malik's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the situation beginning to sink in. A woman in the crowd, Emma, her voice dripping with scorn, called out above the others. "What's he doing here, huh? Too good to help his own people. Now he's saving a white man?" Her words were like a slap in the face. She pointed directly at Malik, accusing him of some betrayal of his own race. "He doesn't belong here, trying to help someone like him," she added, her voice shrill. The mob's hostility grew, their faces contorted with anger and judgment. Malik's body tensed as each insult hit him like a blow. His mind was racing, trying to stay focused on the task at hand while everything around him threatened to unravel. His stomach twisted with shame and frustration. The words felt like a personal attack on who he was, who he represented, yet he couldn't afford to let it break him. Malik's inner turmoil was evident. He had never faced such venom before. This was different. This was more than just hatred directed at him. It was a rejection of his humanity, his right to make a difference. The shouts, the racial slurs, and the disdain burned in his ears, but his resolve only strengthened. The faces around him blurred, but his eyes never left Tyler. He had been trained for moments like this, taught that his duty to another human being outweighed all the hatred, all the doubt, and all the prejudice that existed. The conflict inside him was fierce, but his training and his humanity pushed him forward. He could not walk away. He would not let the hate define him or his actions. Malik's hands were soaked in blood, his fingers trembling as they pressed against the wound on Tyler's head. Every second counted now. The man's breathing was shallow, his body twitching, barely clinging to life. Malik could feel the life slipping away from him with every ragged breath. But despite the overwhelming noise of the crowd around him, there was still a flicker of hope. Tyler wasn't gone yet. He was still alive. Malik's heart raced as he realized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a moment of chance. It was his moment to make a real difference, to act when everyone else had turned away. But the tension in the air, the hostility from the mob made it harder to focus. The more they jeered and shouted, the more impossible it felt to keep his composure. He could hear them, loud and venomous, calling out from all sides. Their words were hateful, dismissive, but they weren't going to stop him. Not now. Not when he could save this man's life. Malik stood up slowly, his legs shaking, and turned to face the crowd. His eyes flashed with a quiet defiance as he raised his voice above the jeers. "I don't care what you think. I'm saving his life." His voice cracked with emotion, but his words rang clear, filled with the weight of his resolve. For a moment, the crowd faltered. The noise of the mob seemed to hit a wall, but only for a brief second. The jeers grew louder, taunting him further, pushing against his confidence. "You think he deserves saving?" someone shouted. "He's just a white guy. He doesn't need your help." But Malik stood firm, his gaze unwavering. The world seemed to shrink around him. He could feel the anger rising inside him, but he wasn't going to back down. Not now. And then, just as the noise reached its peak, something unexpected happened. From the back of the crowd, an older woman stepped forward. Sarah, a white woman in her late 50s, stood there, her face etched with concern as she watched the scene unfold. She had been quiet until now, holding her phone in hand, recording the moment. But she had seen enough. She had witnessed Malik's selflessness, his determination, and she couldn't stay silent any longer. "Stop!" Sarah's voice rang out with surprising strength, cutting through the noise. Her words were firm, commanding the attention of the crowd. "This boy's doing the right thing." For a moment, the crowd went silent. The taunts died down as the eyes of the onlookers turned toward Sarah. The moment hung in the air, tense and uncertain, as she stepped closer to Malik. She could feel the heat of the mob's hostility, but her voice didn't waver. "What he's doing is the true test of humanity," she continued, her eyes meeting Malik's with compassion. "It's not about the color of his skin. It's about saving a life. And that's what matters. He's doing what's right." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd as Sarah's words began to settle in. For the first time, the anger in the air shifted. Some of the onlookers began to glance at each other, a flicker of understanding passing between them. They were beginning to question the hatred they'd been swept up in, seeing the humanity in Malik's actions. But there were still others who remained unmoved, their faces set in stone, unwilling to let go of their prejudices. The divide was clear, but Sarah's words had made a crack in the wall of anger. "Help him, young man," Sarah said softly, her gaze never leaving Malik. "You're doing the right thing." Malik took a deep breath, his heart still pounding, but now there was something different, something lighter. He nodded, looking down at Tyler, who was still clinging to life in his arms. The crowd's hostility hadn't vanished, but for a moment it felt as if he wasn't completely alone in the fight. As Malik leaned back over Tyler to apply more pressure to the wound, Sarah stayed close by, standing firm against the tide of hatred. Her presence, though small, was a reminder of the power of standing up for what was right, even in the face of overwhelming opposition. Just as the mob's anger seemed ready to overwhelm Malik, the distant sound of sirens began to pierce the tension in the air. At first, it was faint, barely audible over the jeers and shouts, but as the sound grew louder, the crowd's anger seemed to lose some of its fire. The sirens grew closer, the promise of help on its way. Relief flooded Malik's chest as he heard the familiar rush of the ambulance approaching. It was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment when he could step back and leave Tyler's fate in the hands of the professionals. the ambulance arrived, its lights flashing and sirens blaring. The paramedics rushed out of the vehicle with swift efficiency, their focus entirely on the task at hand. They moved with practiced precision, surrounding Tyler's body with care as they worked to stabilize him. Malik stepped back, his hands still trembling from the effort, but his heart was beginning to slow. He had done all he could. As the paramedics began their work, Malik watched them closely, his mind racing with thoughts of the mob that had tried to tear him down. The crowd, once so aggressive, now stood at the edges, subdued by the arrival of the medical team. Some of them still held their phones, unsure whether to keep recording or to silently witness the final moments of this tense ordeal. Malik's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned slowly, his guard still up, unsure of what to expect. It was Jim, the same man who had shouted at him earlier, who had tried to force him out of the scene. Jim, now a little quieter, his face less filled with anger and more with a hint of guilt, took slow steps toward Malik. The hostility in Jim's eyes had been replaced by something else, something that Malik couldn't quite name. Jim's voice was quieter now, almost tentative as he approached Malik. "Thank you," he muttered, his tone thick with an emotion Malik hadn't expected. You did the right thing." Malik felt the weight of Jim's words settle in his chest. He had expected nothing, not after everything that had been said to him, but here it was, an acknowledgement, a recognition of his humanity. It wasn't a grand apology or a change of heart, but it was something. It was a small crack in the hardened walls of prejudice that had surrounded Jim, and maybe, just maybe, others in the crowd. Malik nodded, still shaken but proud of what he had done. His chest rose and fell with each breath, steadying now that he knew Tyler's fate was no longer in his hands. He had made a choice, and that choice had been to act when everyone else stood frozen. He had been faced with hatred, with anger, but his decision to help was something he would carry with him forever. The paramedics finished their work, carefully loading Tyler into the ambulance. The crowd, which had once raged, now stood in relative silence, watching as the emergency vehicle drove off. A few of the onlookers put down their phones, no longer interested in recording, some even exchanging quiet words with those around them. They had witnessed something that had made them pause, made them rethink their assumptions. Malik took a deep breath as he turned to walk away from the scene. His head was held high, despite the heavy weight of the moment still pressing on him. He had faced hatred and hostility, but he had chosen to act with compassion. His steps were slow, but there was purpose in them now. He knew that the world around him hadn't changed yet. There was still much to be done, but in that moment, he had made a difference. He had saved a life, and he had proven to himself that in the face of overwhelming adversity, humanity could still prevail. The camera pulled back, showing the quiet street now, once filled with tension and anger, now calm. The mob had dispersed, leaving behind only the whispers of those who had witnessed the moment. Tyler was on his way to the hospital, and Malik's act of kindness had planted a seed that would one day grow into something much bigger. The crowd had witnessed something different today, and Malik had sparked something inside them, no matter how small. Weeks passed since that day in the street, but the ripple effect of Malik's bravery continued to spread. News outlets began reporting on the story of the black boy who had faced a hostile mob to save a white man's life. The headlines read like a call for change, young black man risks everything to save a stranger, proving humanity still prevails. The story went viral, shared across social media, and discussed in every corner of the nation. People were talking about racism, about the kind of courage it took to defy hatred, about what it meant to stand up for a fellow human being. Malik's story wasn't just a headline. It was a conversation starter. It wasn't about the divide between races or the bitterness that had clouded the world for so long. It was about a simple, powerful act of humanity. And the world needed it. The world was ready for it. As the weeks went by, the conversation grew. Activists, community leaders, and everyday people began to share Malik's story as a beacon of hope, a reminder that small acts of kindness could spark real change. People began to reflect on their own actions, their own prejudices, and ask themselves if they would have done the same thing in Malik's shoes. For Malik, the world around him had changed, but it didn't feel like anything was instantly different. He had spent his whole life in the margins, and even now, the streets he walked were filled with the same struggles. Yet something had shifted, something deep within the community, something even inside him. People recognized him now. They smiled at him on the street, nodded their heads in quiet acknowledgement. The boy who had been caught in the shadows of his neighborhood was now a symbol of something bigger: bravery, humanity, and the possibility of change. One afternoon, Malik walked down a busy street, the sun shining down on the sidewalk, casting long shadows on the pavement. He moved through the crowd with purpose, his steps measured but confident. He passed familiar faces, some strangers, some people who had seen him on the news, heard his name spoken in passing. As he walked, he nodded to a few people, and they responded with a smile, a brief acknowledgement that something had changed. The crowd that had once jeered at him, the same people who had tried to tear him down, now seemed different. They had faded into the background, no longer as loud or hostile. There was a quiet reflection in the air, a sense that something had shifted. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. People were thinking, really thinking, about the power of kindness, the necessity of standing up against hate, and the importance of empathy in a divided world. Malik's gaze shifted upward, and for the first time in a long time, he could see beyond the streets, beyond the pain. He could see a future, not just for him, but for others. A future shaped by compassion, by small actions that rippled out into something greater. The world might not be perfect, but he had made a mark on it, a mark that would be remembered for years to come. As Malik continued walking, the sound of the city buzzing around him felt different. The noise wasn't as sharp, the stares weren't as judgmental. People nodded at him, seeing him not as a stranger, but as someone who had sparked something deep within them, a reminder that we are all capable of change, of being better, of making the world just a little brighter with every act of kindness. And in that moment, Malik knew that his actions had planted a seed. The roots were still small, still fragile, but they were growing. And one day, that seed of hope would blossom into something bigger, something lasting.